autumn of 1943 was a major turning point for the mighty 8th.
The battle was going on and raging at such a pace I didn't even know that we were hit.
It was a critical phase in the air war in Europe.
We're losing 1,000 feet a minute. Pick your time and jump.
And therefore, by default, the war itself.
They had to get him out of the turret and pull his chute and toss him out of the aircraft.
The time had come for the 8th Bomber Command to step up to the plate and hit some home runs.
By that time, of course, the plane was pretty well on fire, so the pilots says, bail out.
The number of heroes and the number of casualties would also be the biggest to date. The price of freedom would inevitably be higher still. By the last Friday in July 1943, the mighty 8th had flown 80 missions into Nazi-occupied Europe, including Hanover, Bremen, Kiel, and Kassel. For the month of August, the missions continued, and Generals Eaker and Anderson also had something special planned. Mission 84 was a new and ambitious plan to cripple the German aircraft industry. It was a double strike mission, with 2 large forces of bombers attacking separate targets in order to disperse and weaken fighter defense. Mission 84 was proudly flown on the first anniversary of the 8th Air Force's very first daylight raid on the Rouen-Sauté marshalling yards. It did not go well. As soon as the reconnaissance photographs were received on the evening of the 17th, Generals Eaker and Anderson knew that the Regensburg-Schweinfurt raid had been a failure. The strike by the 16 bomb groups was well beyond the range of escorting fighters, and the first bomb wing was over German-occupied territory for 3 hours and 30 minutes, for which 2 hours and 10 minutes of that time they had no fighter escort whatsoever. The Luftwaffe fighter aces had a field day. The bombers did hit their targets, but at a catastrophic loss to the bomb group. As a result, the 8th Air Force was unable to follow up the same week with a second attack, one that might have seriously crippled German industry. In Regensburg, all 6 main workshops of the Messerschmitt factory were destroyed or severely damaged. In Schweinfurt, the 2 largest factories suffered 80 direct hits, and incendiary bombs ignited the machine oil used in the manufacturing process. But the price paid by the bomber crews was just too high. By early October 1943, the mighty 8th and the Luftwaffe met in savage combat in the skies over Germany during a series of missions. On October the 8th, they attacked Bremen with the loss of 29 B-17s. The next day, they attacked Anklam, Marienburg, and Gdynia with a loss of 28 B-17 flying fortresses. On the 10th of October, they attacked Münster, Coesfeld, and Enschede, with 30 B-17 bombers lost. Just 4 days later, the 8th prepared to attack the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt once again. This time, The planners added additional fighter escorts to cover the outward and return legs of the operation, and sent the entire bomber force against Schweinfurt alone, instead of splitting the force. Despite these changes, a series of minor mishaps combined with the German anti-aircraft effort proved to be devastating. The bomber formations were spread out and vulnerable because of bad weather. German intelligence suspected a deep penetration air raid, and their defenses were ready. It included the substantial use of rockets as well as anti-aircraft guns and swarms of fighter aircraft. Of the 291 B-17 flying fortresses sent on this mission, 77 were lost, and 121 had severe battle damage. The mighty 8th lost over 26% of its attacking force, with 650 men killed or captured. Mission 115 was a disaster. It would forever be known as Black Thursday. The strategy of the Allied air forces was flawed. With the losses of aircraft and crew reaching a new high in late 1943, operations were actually paused while a solution was sought. The American official history of the Army Air Forces in the Second World War acknowledged that losses had been so great that the 8th Air Force had, for some time, lost air superiority over Germany. The following suspension of deep raids lasted for over 4 months. A big part of the solution to the problem of protecting the bomber streams was the introduction and deployment of the new and improved longer-range P-51 Mustang. The North American P-51 was one of the most effective and versatile single-seat aircraft of the war. It was armed with 6 powerful 50 caliber machine guns, equivalent to around half of a B-17 heavy bomber's guns, and carried 1,840 rounds of ammunition per sortie. The later variants of the P-51 charged through the skies using the Spitfire's Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, giving it a staggering maximum speed of 440 miles per hour. It was fast, maneuverable, and deadly. But most importantly, it had a massive range of 1,650 miles when using the extra external fuel tanks, meaning it could escort the bombers of the mighty 8th all the way to Germany and back. This would help reduce bomber losses significantly. Eighth Bomber Command was redesignated as the 8th Air Force. General Carl Spaatz returned to England to assume overall command of air operations, and Major General Jimmy Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force. His directive was simple: win the air war and isolate the battlefield. Spaatz and Doolittle's plan was to use the newly formed United States Strategic Air Forces in a series of coordinated raids on the German aircraft industry. The plan, codenamed Operation Argument, would be supported by RAF night bombing. Operation Argument became known as Big Week. Perfect weather conditions in the last week of February 1944 gave the green light to this maximum effort campaign, and on the night of 19th of February, the RAF bombed Leipzig with 823 aircraft. followed the next day by 1,000 8th Air Force B-17s and B-24s, plus over 800 fighters, as well as 16 squadrons of RAF P-51 Mustangs and Supermarine Spitfires. 12 Nazi aircraft factories were attacked, and the production of German Junkers 88s, Messerschmitt 109s, 110s, Focke-Wulf 190s, and Heinkel 111 bombers were all brought to a halt. The next day, over 1,600 bombers and fighters of the 8th Air Force hit more aircraft factories in Braunschweig and shot down over 60 Luftwaffe fighters. On the 24th of February, the 8th Air Force sent a force of over 800 bombers hitting Schweinfurt as well as targets on the Baltic coast. The following day, both the 8th and the 15th Air Forces hit numerous targets at Fürth, Augsburg, and Regensburg, attacking Messerschmitt 110 and 109 plants. Losses of Allied crews and aircraft were massively reduced. The breakthrough strategy had worked. In fact, the big weak raids on the German aircraft industry had caused so much damage that the Germans were forced to move aircraft manufacturing eastward to safer parts of the Reich. Just a few days after Big Week, the 8th Air Force made its first attack on the Reich's capital, Berlin. On the 6th of March 1944, over 700 heavy bombers along with 800 escort fighters hit numerous targets within Berlin, dropping the first American bombs on the German capital.
The United States Army Air Force is off for Berlin. Bucking a 70-mile-an-hour headwind, our flying forts hit temperatures ranging as low as 58 below zero as it bombs away over the German capital. One of our motors is shot out as we head for home after this big raid that cost us 14 bombers. That channel is a welcome sight. Air Force pictures show how flares are used to signal which forts have wounded crewmen aboard and to send medical ground crews into action. They'll be ready with first aid and blood plasma. The first American flag to fly over Berlin. Heroes of the 8th Air Force. They tell of their first daylight raid.
I'd like to introduce the pilot of the crew on this lead ship, Lieutenant Brown. Brownie?
Colonel, I was glad that I was along with him. I don't care about too many of them like that.
Fine. Sergeant, you were flying as waist gunner in the Sack Robbers.
Well, Colonel, all I got to say is my birthday that day, and it was a hell of a place to celebrate a birthday, but it was well worth it to be the first one to go over to Berlin.
Well, boys, how would you like to go over again?
The mighty 8th were relentless, dropping over 4,800 tons of high explosive on Berlin during the first week of March alone. One notable 8th Air Force casualty was Brigadier General Arthur W. Vanneman, Chief of Intelligence, who was captured by the Germans in northern France on the 27th of June 1944, becoming the highest-ranking American POW captured in Europe during the war. Many 8th Air Force heroes were killed in the air. However, some, like Brigadier Vanneman, were able to escape a damaged aircraft by bailing out with a parachute.
There was absolutely no fear of bailing out. Once I'm out in the air, there's absolutely no sensation of falling. There's no reference point. Is the big reason. There's no feeling of falling. Once I straightened out, I fell free because I knew that we had been at 27,000 and I had nausea pretty bad.
Some were even able to land or crash land their stricken planes in enemy territory and walk away from the wreck. In the early part of the war, crashed aircrew were taken prisoner and sent to prisoner of war camps throughout the Third Reich, often spending the rest of the war in captivity. Later, as Hitler's Nazi regime began to crumble, German ground units and even German civilians were encouraged to commit atrocities against captured aircrew.
According to the missing aircrew reports, our pilot was found about 500 meters from the plane. In my opinion, that is not true. I believe that he was shot from the ground because he had opened a chute and he came down, and since they were shooting at me, I reasoned that they did shoot him.
Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels launched a plan to convince German workers and civilians to kill Allied airmen on sight, claiming that civilians had a right to exact murderous revenge on Allied aircrews because the Allies were bombing German cities. Goebbels referred to Allied air personnel as terror flyers or murder flyers, air gangsters, and even air barbarians.
Before we left the carnage that was our prison camp in the Palm Gardens, as we were marching out, we did see 3 RAF bodies hanging from telephone lines, where evidently they had been lynched, by German civilians.
Hitler lent his full support when on July 5, 1944, he issued an order in which he decreed that any British and American airmen answering to Goebbels' description of a terrorist would not be treated as a prisoner of war, but instead will be killed as soon as he falls into German hands.
When they unloaded this off the train at Frankfurt, the RAF was just leaving, and I saw the German civilians capturing English flyers, wiring their hands and back up and throwing them into burning buildings. So they did not like anybody.
Hundreds of Allied airmen were murdered after touching German soil by both German soldiers and frenzied German civilians wielding shovels, pitchforks, and rocks.
I remember one group commander, colonel, was shot down, captured, and the SS troops spread-eagled him on the front of their tank.
When I bailed out, I landed up in the hills. My pilot, who must have bailed out the top hatch, and my guess is hit his legs against the rudders of the B-24, landed down in the valley, and was not able to get up and run. While I watched, some farmers came by and pitchforked him to death. And that night I went down and I got his dog tags. And the next day when some of the Germans came by, they said, well, this is what the American bombers deserve.
As we marched through the town, we realized that the German guards were our best buddies, at least for today, because the German civilians were attacking us with anything, pitchforks, rakes, rocks. And as we walked through the town, which was in smithereens, and you could look and see toilets hanging and plumbing hanging off the side, sirens still wailing, and just complete chaos. For a moment you realize that these people really didn't like you, and probably for good reason, because you were part and parcel of the Allied team that had done this.
Whilst the heroes of the mighty 8th were fighting in the skies during the spring of 1944, the Allied ground forces were preparing the biggest invasion force the world had ever seen for the inevitable assault on Hitler's fortress Europe. In a prelude to the invasion, the 8th Air Force air attacks began in February. Missions were flown against railroad junctions, airfields, ports and bridges in northern France as well as along the English Channel coastline. By the 6th of June, Allied fighter pilots had succeeded in damaging or destroying thousands of enemy locomotives, motorized vehicles, rail and road networks, bridges, crossroads, fortifications and airfields in France and in Belgium. On D-Day itself, over 2,300 sorties were flown by 8th Air Force heavy bombers in the Normandy and Cherbourg invasion areas, all aimed at neutralizing enemy coastal defenses and frontline troops. After D-Day, attacks on the German oil industry became a top priority. In late 1944 and into early 1945, vast fleets of Liberators and Flying Forts, escorted by P-51 Mustangs and long-range P-38 Lightnings, hit oil refineries in Germany and Czechoslovakia. By the end of 1944, only 3 out of the Reich's 91 oil refineries were still working normally. Many of the others were only partially functional, and most were completely destroyed. The Meersburg fuel refineries in Lerna were also a priority target. This was where the majority of Germany's synthetic fuel for jet propulsion was made. Destroying these factories was vital to slow and prevent the deployment of Nazi wonder weapons like jet fighters and jet-propelled rockets. The Messerschmitt 262 was the world's first operational jet-powered fighter aircraft. Its development actually involved both the Luftwaffe's Reich Marshal Hermann Göring and the Führer himself, Adolf Hitler. It was one of the most advanced World War II combat aircraft. It was first seen in action by Allied airmen during the late summer of 1944. But it wasn't until March 1945 that German jet aircraft started to attack Allied bomber formations. The Luftwaffe jets, however, were simply too few and too late to have any serious effect on the Allied air armadas now sweeping across the Third Reich. The V-1 flying bomb, also known as the buzz bomb or doodlebug, was a jet-powered bomb guided by a gyroscope system which was designed to cut the engine when over the target, causing it to drop and explode. The impact crater was up to 100 feet wide and often created a damage zone of between 400 and 600 yards in any direction. The name V1 was short for Vergeltungswaffe 1, or Vengeance Weapon 1. Unsurprisingly, therefore, it was first launched against London on the 13th of June 1944, just 1 week after D-Day. On some days during the summer, more than 100 V-1 rockets a day were fired at the southeast of England. Later, the Germans directed V-1s at the port of Antwerp and other targets in Belgium. The attacks stopped only a month before the war in Europe ended, when the last launch site in the Low Countries was overrun on the 29th of March 1945. Around 12,500 V-1 rockets were fired during the war. The V-1 weighed 4,740 pounds. The V-2 dwarfed it at a staggering 27,600 pounds. The V-2 was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. It was developed to attack Allied cities in retaliation for the Allied bombing of German cities. It was also the first artificial object to travel into space. Only 2,600 Vengeance Weapon 2 missiles were launched against the Allies before their threat was eliminated. In fact, the mighty 8th, as part of the now fearsome Allied air power, helped make short work of all these so-called wonder weapons, destroying their launch sites and airfields by bombing from much lower altitudes, with the B-26 Marauder coming into its own once more, delivering deadly bomb loads in low-level, high-speed raids. Having total air superiority throughout the collapsing German Reich was next on the list for the 8th Air Force. Major General Jimmy Doolittle made a critical change to the policy of his many fighter aircraft on escort duty.
In February 1944, there was a sudden change. Our fighters were ordered to range wider, to seek the enemy in the air and on the ground instead of waiting for him, and above all, to follow him to his destruction.
American pilots on bomber defense missions would now fly far ahead of the bombers, literally clearing the skies of any Luftwaffe fighter opposition as they headed towards the target. This strategy fatally disabled German defenses, and once the bombers had hit their targets, the fighter pilots were then free to strafe German airfields and transport whilst returning to base. This enabled them to destroy the Luftwaffe on the ground as well as in the air.
Once again, a better cause, better planning and leadership, better equipment, and beyond everything else, the valor of our fighter pilots gave us victory. Only this time, it was decisive. So many of the enemy's aircraft exploded over his own forest and housetops, or were driven flaming wrecks into the ground. So many of his famous fighter leaders met death at the hands of our pilots that his morale was shattered. His defense plan was smashed. Quickly, our fighters seized their opportunity. Since the enemy did not come up to fight, down they went to blast his planes to pieces and burn them on his own aerodromes all over Western Europe and in the very heart of Germany. It was the most savage and devastating fighter attack on record. Returning from unchallenged escort duty and on many special missions, they burned his aircraft by hundreds from one airfield to another.
Although Hitler's air power could, and did, mount effective attacks on the ever larger formations of Allied heavy bombers, the sheer numbers of B-17s and B-24s attacking enemy targets was overwhelming the German fighter force, which simply could not sustain the losses the 8th Air Force was inflicting upon it.
Intense enemy flak, sheets of machine gun fire from flak towers and ground installations caused us heavy losses. 4 times as many as the same number of fighters would sustain in aerial combat. But our fighters never flinched, and by their courage, faced destruction in single-engine planes only a few feet above the ground and 500 miles from their bases, until they had smashed the heavily concentrated frontline operational strength of the German Air Force forever. Now that the sky was ours, another great opportunity became ours too. The destruction of the enemy's transportation system that fed and supplied the great armies counted on to repel the Allied invasion forces. The enemy's roads and railroads were struck with the mighty force of air power. These were tense days, crucial days, and both sides knew it. Our fighters, freed by their bitterly won victory in the air, became a dominant factor on the ground. They exploded locomotives by the thousands and burned freight cars in uncounted numbers. No train in daylight hours was safe. No target too small. Even a single railroad car. No marshalling yard a haven. The enemy's desperately needed rail transport system was shattered all over the map.
At the beginning of 1945, the Luftwaffe attempted one last major air offensive against the Allied air forces. On Monday, the 1st of January, the entire German fighter force in the west attacked 27 Allied airfields in northern France, Belgium, and the southern part of the Netherlands. Over 950 fighters set out in an attempt by the Luftwaffe to cripple Allied air forces in the Low Countries of Europe. It was a last-ditch effort to keep up the momentum of the German forces during the Battle of the Bulge. The losses suffered by the German air arm were irreplaceable, with over 300 Luftwaffe aircraft being shot down. On the 7th of April 1945, the Luftwaffe flew its most desperate and deadliest mission, with the dedicated aerial ramming unit Sonderkommando Elbe. This operation involved German pilots ramming their worn-out Messerschmitt 109s into American bombers, in order to get the Allies to suspend bombing raids long enough for the remaining factories to make a significant amount of Me-262 jet fighters. The 8th Air Force was targeted in this operation and responded by dispatching 32 Flying Fortress and Liberator groups and 14 Mustang groups to targets in the small area of Germany still controlled by the Nazis, hitting the remaining airfields where the Luftwaffe was stationed. Almost 300 German aircraft were destroyed on the ground over the course of the day. On the 16th of April, the record was broken when over 700 German aircraft were destroyed on the ground by strafing and bombing missions. The end came on the 25th of April 1945, when the 8th Air Force flew its last full-scale mission of the European War. B-17 Flying Fortresses hit the Skoda armaments factory at Pilsen in Czechoslovakia, whilst B-24 Liberators bombed rail complexes in Bad Reichenau and Freilassing surrounding Hitler's mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden. Victory in Europe followed quickly on Wednesday, the 8th of May.
Peace is signed with German General Jodl acting for the remnants of the Nazi government. Jodl, for a few hours, was the chief of staff of the German army, while de Fuhrer's successor, Admiral Dönitz, was strangely missing. This is the news that electrified the world: unconditional surrender. In the temporary headquarters of General Eisenhower, cameras record the scene as terms are laid down, with the Supreme Commander represented by General Walter B. Smith.
Following the end of the war in Europe, the mighty 8th moved to Okinawa later that month, where the unit started to train new bomber groups for combat against Japan. But before combat operations in the Pacific could begin, the story of the 8th Air Force would come full circle. On the 17th of August 1942, the first 8th Bomber Command heavy bomber mission of the war was launched from England against German targets in France, heralding the arrival of the Air Force that would not be turned back.
Our first test in tactics came August 17th. It was a critical day for the 8th Bomber Command when we loaded up for the first U.S. raid from England in U.S. planes in daylight. General Ira Aker had told us that the target was the great marshalling yard near Rouen in Nazi-occupied France. There were still plenty of skeptics who predicted dismal results from the first attempt at a daylight mission. Generals Spots and Aker had to prove them wrong. Our morale had worn pretty thin from repeated dry runs and public impatience for American action in the European theater. Each guy acted nonchalant, but we were fully aware of the long-range strategic planning that hinged on this particular mission. Maybe we didn't know any better, but we had plenty of confidence. Confidence in our weapons, confidence in our buddies and the way they did their job. We didn't think of ourselves as heroes, just hot rocks. But heroes or not, the flying privates, sergeants, and generals were putting their lives on the line, knowing full well what the odds were. At the controls of one of the lead ships was the old man himself, General Aker, flying a B-17 which someone aptly named Yankee Doodle. As the bombers pulled up their gear, American flyers and 12 American machines assembled over the British countryside, ready to test an American idea in France, high-altitude precision bombing. As England disappeared behind us, we took up battle stations. Our bombardiers and gunners knew that the fate of the mission and the lives of the crew depended on them. We took turns manning the guns, expecting opposition. One of the crew pointed out the city of Rouen, where Joan of Arc had died for the liberation of France. Now, airplanes named Baby Doll, Peggy D, and Yankee Doodle were spoiling to fight for the same thing.
German warning centers, caught by surprise, didn't report the fortresses until they were well on their way to the target.
We made a direct run for a point about 3 miles north of Rouen and then a slight turn to the right for the bombing approach. All of us flying this first U.S. bomber raid wondered why the sky was clear of enemy fighters and flak. Visibility was excellent, something you don't get for night bombing. All 12 planes dropped a total of 37,000 pounds of bombs.
That mission was led by mighty 8th legend Colonel Paul Tibbets. On the 6th of August 1945, Tibbets led another mission. Together with his original navigator, Theodore Van Kirk, he took off from the Mariana Islands in a B-29 superfortress called Enola Gay. His orders were to drop the first atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima.
The Enola Gay's mission starts from Tinian in the Marianas. The crew has had their final briefing on weather and air-sea rescue. Only yesterday they have been told of the true power of the weapon they are to carry. The massive bomb has been loaded. At 2:45 in the morning, August 6, 1945, Colonel Tibbets takes the Enola Gay down the runway into the air, beginning the 6.5-hour flight to Japan. Over Iwo Jima, they begin the slow climb to bombing altitude. At 8:15, a weather plane reports from Hiroshima that conditions are good. 2/10 lower and middle, and 2/10 at 15,000 feet. As they approach the target area, the weapon is checked for the last time. At 9:11, 31,000 feet over Hiroshima, the Enola Gay begins the bomb run. At 9:15, the bomb is dropped. The aircraft banks away at high speed. Just 50 seconds later, 15 miles from ground zero, the Enola Gay is rocked by the blast.
After a subsequent atomic bomb mission against Nagasaki, the Japanese surrendered on the 15th of August 1945, and the Second World War was over. The Mighty Eighth has since fought in every major conflict around the globe. It spearheaded campaigns in Korea and Vietnam, carried out peacekeeping duties in the Cold War, flew 325 sorties as part of NATO, and saw action in both Gulf Wars and Afghanistan. The 8th Air Force today is a big part of the United States Air Force's Air Force Global Strike Command. And its current headquarters is at Barksdale Air Force Base, Louisiana. But from May 1942 to July 1945, the Mighty Eighth planned and precisely executed America's daylight strategic bombing campaign against Nazi-occupied Europe. In doing so, they earned their name, reputation, and place in history, compiling an impressive and sobering war record. 600,000 sorties flown, 700,000 tons of bombs dropped, 14,000 enemy aircraft destroyed, 17 Medals of Honor were awarded, as well as 220 Distinguished Service Crosses, 850 Silver Stars, 7,000 Purple Hearts, and 46,000 Distinguished Flying Crosses. 442,300 Air Medals were awarded, and 261 Fighter Aces confirmed. 47,000 men did not return from combat. The sacrifice, the courage, and the determination of the men and women of the mighty 8th during World War II and beyond will live on forever.